The C-SPAN networks bring you long-form public affairs programming from the nation's capital and are a public service of your television provider. C-SPAN, created by cable.
Order. Colleagues, we meet today in heartbreaking sadness, but also in heartfelt solidarity. Any death in such awful circumstances is an outrage and a tragedy. Yet this death, in this manner, of this person, our democratically elected colleague Jo Cox, is particularly shocking and repugnant. All of us who came to know Jo during her all too short service in this House became swiftly aware of her outstanding qualities. She was caring, eloquent, principled, and wise. Above all, she was filled with and fueled by love for humanity. Devoted to her family and a relentless campaigner for equality, human rights, and social justice. Jo was proud to be the Member of Parliament for Batley and Spen, where she had her roots, and she was determined to live life to the full. She succeeded superbly. Jo was murdered in the course of her duty, serving constituents in need. She fought for them, just as she fought for others, at home and abroad, who were victims of poverty, discrimination, or injustice. An attack like this strikes not only at an individual, but at our freedom. That is why we assemble here, both to honour Jo and to redouble our dedication to democracy. I call the Leader of the Opposition, Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last Thursday, Jo Cox was doing what all of us here do, representing and serving the people who elected her. We have lost one of our own, and our society as a whole has lost one of our very best. She'd spent her life serving and campaigning for other people, whether as a worker for Oxfam or for the anti-slavery charity, the Freedom Fund, as a political activist and as a feminist. The horrific act that took her from us was an attack on democracy, on our whole country, has been shocked and saddened by it. But in the days since, the country has also learnt something of the extraordinary humanity and compassion which drove her political activism and beliefs. Jo Cox didn't just believe in loving her neighbour. She believed in loving her neighbour's neighbour. She saw a world of neighbours. She believed every life counted equally. In a very moving tribute, Kate Allen, the director of Amnesty International, said, "Her campaigning on refugees, Syria, and the rights of women and girls made her stand out as an MP who always put the lives of the most vulnerable at the heart of her work." Her former colleague at the Freedom Fund, Nick Grono, said, "Jo was a powerful champion for the world's most vulnerable and marginalised. She spoke out in support of refugees, for the Palestinian people and against Islamophobia in this country. Her integrity and talent was known by everyone in this House, by the community of Batley and Spen, which she proudly represented here for the past year. But it was that community in Batley and Spen that brought her up, as well, of course, as her wonderful family, to whom we share their grief today. Her community and the whole country has been united in grief and united in rejecting the well of hatred that killed her in what increasingly appears to have been an act of extreme political violence. We're filled with sorrow for her husband, Brendan, and young children. They will never see her again, but they can be so proud of everything she was, all she achieved, and all she stood for, as we are, as are her parents, as is her sister and her whole wider family. Jo would have been 42 this Wednesday. She had much more to give, and much more that she would have achieved. I want to thank the heroes who tried to intervene. Bernard Kenny, a 77-year-old former miner, saw the need and ran to Jo's aid. He was stabbed and taken to hospital. I'm sure, Mr. Speaker, the whole House will join me in wishing Mr. Kenny a speedy and full recovery. Many shopkeepers and bystanders also tried to help. Administered first aid to both Jo and Bernard, the police officers who made the arrest, and the National Health Service paramedics who were on the scene so quickly. In her maiden speech last year, Jo said this: "Our communities have been deeply enhanced by immigration. While we celebrate our diversity, what surprises me time and time again as I travel round the constituency is that we are far more united and have far more in common with each other than things that divide us. We need, Mr. Speaker, a kinder and gentler politics. This is not a factional or party political point. We all have a responsibility in this House and beyond not to whip up hatred or sow division." Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Prime Minister and to Rose Hudson-Wilkins, our wonderful chaplain, for accompanying me to the vigil for Jo last Friday in Birstall, at the priestly statue in the centre of that lovely town. We, all of us, were moved by the unity and warmth of the crowd brought together in grief and solidarity. I've been very moved by the public outpourings since her death, the hundreds of letters and emails we've all received in solidarity with Jo's family in their hour of grief, and by the outpouring of charitable donations to causes close to her heart: White Helmets, Hope Not Hate, and the Royal Voluntary Services. Last night, my honourable friend, the member for Islington South and Finsbury, and myself held a vigil outside our town hall, one of hundreds of vigils attended by tens of thousands of people right across our land who are so shocked by what's happened and want to express that shock and that grief. I also want to thank the other parties in this House who've offered their sympathy and support at this very difficult time. We're united in grief at her loss. And we must be aware her killing is an attack on our democracy. It is an attack on our whole society. As my honourable friend, the member for Wirral South, wrote recently, Jo's life was a demonstration against despair. And in her tragic death, we can come together to change our politics, to tolerate a little more and condemn a little less. Jo's grieving husband, Brendan, said, "Jo believed in a better world, and she fought for it every day of her life with an energy and a zest for life that would exhaust most people." Today, we remember Jo's compassion and a passion to create a better world. And in her honour, Mr. Speaker, we recommit ourselves to that task. Thank you.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're here today to remember an extraordinary colleague and friend. Jo Cox was a voice of compassion whose irrepressible spirit and boundless energy lit up the lives of all who knew her and saved the lives of many she never, ever met. Today we grieve her loss, and we hold in our hearts and prayers her husband Brendan, her parents and sister, and her 2 children, who are just 3 and 5 years old. We express our anger at the sickening and despicable attack that killed her, as she did her job serving her constituents on the streets of Birstall. And let me join the Leader of the Opposition in his moving words in praising Bernard Kenny and all those who tried to save her. But above all in this House, we pay tribute to a loving, determined, passionate and progressive politician who epitomised the best of humanity and who proved so often the power of politics to make our world a better place. I first met Jo in 2006 in Darfur. She was doing what she was so brilliant at, bravely working in one of the most dangerous parts of the world, fighting for the lives of refugees. Her decision to welcome me, then a Conservative Leader of the Opposition, had not been entirely welcomed by all her colleagues and friends. But it was typical of her determination to reach across party lines on issues that she felt were so much more important than party politics. Jo was a humanitarian to her core, a passionate and brilliant campaigner whose grit and determination to fight for justice saw her time and time again driving issues up the agenda and making people listen and, above all, act, drawing attention to conflicts in Sudan and the Democratic Republic of Congo, helping to expose the despicable practice of rape in war, her work with Sarah Brown on cutting mortality in childbirth, her support for refugees fleeing the war in Syria. Quite simply, there are people on our planet today who are only here and alive because of Jo. Mr. Speaker, Jo was a committed Democrat and a passionate feminist. She spent years encouraging and supporting women around the world to stand for office, long before she did so herself. When she herself was elected as an MP just over a year ago, she said to one of her colleagues that she did not just want to be known for flying around the world tackling international issues, but that she had a profound duty to stand up for the people of Batley and Spen. And she was absolutely as good as her word. As she said in her maiden speech, Jo was proud to be made in Yorkshire and to serve the area in which she had grown up. She belonged there, and in a constituency of truly multi-ethnic, multi-faith communities, she made people feel that they belonged too. Jo's politics were inspired by love, and the outpouring and unity of the tributes we've seen in the past few days show the extraordinary reach and impact of her message. For in remembering Jo, we show today what she said in this House to be true, and I know it'll be quoted many times today. We are far more united and have far more in common with each other than things that divide us. This Wednesday, as the Leader of the Opposition said, it would have been Jo's 42nd birthday, and there will be a global celebration of her life and values, with simultaneous events in New York and Washington, London, Batley, Brussels, Geneva, Nairobi and Beirut. She should, of course, have been celebrating her birthday by hosting her traditional summer solstice party. And it reminds us that behind the formidable professional was a loving and fun mother, daughter, sister, wife and friend, with a warm, welcoming smile and so often laughter in her voice. Jo brought people together. She saw the best in people, and she brought out the best in them. A brave adventurer and a keen climber, she was never daunted. When most people hear of a place called the Inaccessible Pinnacle, they leave it well alone. Not Jo. She didn't just climb it, she abseiled down it, and did so despite a bad case of morning sickness. And it was her irrepressible spirit that helped to give her such determination and focus in her politics too. A Conservative colleague of mine said this weekend, if you lost your way for a moment in the cut and thrust of political life, meeting Jo would remind you why you went into politics in the first place. Mr. Speaker, there have been so many moving tributes in the past few days, But if I may, I'd like to quote from someone already mentioned, the Honourable Member for Wirral South. Joe, we mourn your loss, yet know that all you stood for is unbreakable. We promise to stand up even though we are broken. We promise that we'll never be cowed by hate. Mr. Speaker, may we and the generations of members that follow us in this House honour Joe's memory by proving that the democracy and freedoms Joe stood for are indeed unbreakable, by continuing to stand up for our constituents and by uniting against the hatred that killed her today and forevermore. Yeah.